Welcome to The Summit, a podcast focused on bringing you the knowledge and insights for industry leaders. I'm your host, Kyle Hamer, and I'm on a mission to help you exceed your potential. Thanks for joining us today on The Summit. I'm here with my special guest, Finlay Kerr. I said it right. Isn't that right, Finlay?
Yep, you got it. That's it, yeah.
Great. Finlay is with a group based in Scotland, so we're very excited to have our first international guest on The Summit today, and we're going to be talking a little bit about brand, why you can't rebrand, and that's not really a thing. And before we do that, though, I'd like to have Finlay tell us, well, Finn, just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and how you got involved in this crazy thing called marketing.
Yes, well, firstly, thank you very much for having me. We're delighted that we're the first international guests. It makes us feel pretty special, but thanks, Kyle, for the invite. And listen, I hope I don't upset anyone with that mildly provocative title that I gave you, but hey, we'll unpack that in a while. Yeah, I'm one of these strange creatures who went to business school and then came out and very soon after set himself up in business. And I was joking with some friends at the weekend because their daughter's about to do the same thing and head off to the Alps to start a ski season. So there's snow out there. She's following her passion, and that's what I did. Told my parents, look, I'm just going to go and do one winter season and then come back and get a proper job. But I fell in with my business partner, still in business with John, because we decided after working for a bigger organization, we can really do this as well ourselves. So we set us up in business running ski chalet holidays, and we had a lot of fun, met some great people and learned some lessons along the way. So I think it's one thing having a business education, but then when you actually get out there and set up a small business yourself, you really learn. And so I kind of stayed as a small business owner, grew those businesses, but still I was still pretty close to the action. Came back to Scotland, set up another business, and went backwards and forwards between the operations, which was great. And putting the formal education along with the experience, then you get to a point where you go, I think I can put my hand up and say I'm a bit of an expert in some of this stuff. And I took on an advisory role in local government. So that meant I was helping more small, medium-sized enterprises in very practical, but with a theoretical background. And after a while of that, I actually managed to convince another colleague who's in academia to set up the consultancy Fresh. And while we will operate across the whole marketing domain, we've kind of focused on brand and brand strategy, to be kind of specific, if you like. So there you go. There's kind of 25 years, whoosh. We're up to date.
25 years in 2 minutes. That's pretty good.
There you go.
We were interrupted by our smallest podcaster, the 5-year-old who comes in for his morning hug. So, now you have, like you said, you have a provocative statement. Your provocative statement is this: there is no such thing as rebranding. Can't do it. Don't do it. Don't waste your money. Why do you feel that way?
Okay, so I'll start off at the most provocative level, and it's part out of frustration in that I see a lot of small, medium-sized enterprises parting with really good money, and that can be 10,000 up to 100,000, depending on the scale of the project and the business. And really all they're doing is mucking about with the visuals. And we like to talk about the iceberg, and they're messing with what is above the water. And they're not stopping to think about, we all know kind of schoolboy science that there's a lot under the water. And that's fine because it can actually work. But if you're not aware of what's below the surface, I believe that you can waste your money, messing about with the visuals. So it's really a big provocative statement just to say, stop, wait a minute. And then the next part of that is often a wake-up call or an education for people when we say your brand, you don't have ownership of it. You don't have complete control over it. You can only manage it or manipulate it, if you like, because your brand actually resides in the head and the hearts of your consumer. It's a perception. It's a combined perception of what they think of you. So then I maybe soften that down a little bit and say, well, okay, you can rebrand if you understand that it's not simply a graphic proposition or a change of palette or strapline or whatever you think it is now. And I know lots of people get that, but I really just want to stop those people that charge on off, spend their money and think that they have rebranded in the broadest sense. Now, there's lots of great graphic designers, there's lots of great branding agencies who will do that work for you because they come from that deeper understanding. They know what's below the surface as well. And at that point, I kind of soften my take on it, as long as, that's a caveat. Everybody understands that as you move forward. So I hope
you talk about not being an owner of your brand, which I think is a really interesting concept. In the fact that you don't own it, it's owned by the perception, the hearts and the minds, I think you said, of your customer, of your audience.
Yeah.
What does that mean when they say that they own it? How can they own it if I'm the person who has the organization? I'm the person that comes up with the colors and the logos and the communication style, and all. How can they actually own that?
So it's a difficult concept, and I think you're right, and that's why humans in general, we prefer something more tangible. It's much easier to understand, and once we go into a little bit of a gray zone, and we're possibly talking about psychology or sociology, it's not so such an easy cry. Marketing is advertising. Give me the visuals. I understand that, but we know that that marketing is actually managing the relationships. It's much more than just pushing out advertising or content. To use the kind of more modern term. So if you can come at it from that marketing viewpoint, a broader understanding of marketing, to say, right, it's managing long-term profitable relationships. And then I think to take that step to say, you don't own the brand, because we realize then that we're talking about what's important is the relationship between us and our customers. So all of a sudden that becomes much softer. And something harder to understand. And good marketers know that they have to be able to walk in their customers' shoes. So I think for those people that have gone down that path, it's probably not such a big step. But we can manage the brand, as long as, if you come with me on that one, to say, right, okay, you don't have complete ownership of it.
Well, and it's interesting the way that you phrase that and position it, because, you think about a relationship, and in a relationship, there's your intent, and then there's the way that it is received. And if you're not understanding how something is received, it doesn't matter what your intent is. It can always lead to some sort of chaos or confusion.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, carrying that on a little bit is that, on the psychological sort of level, if you like, we all like to think that we are logical creatures, and that we have made the decisions, whether that's what to wear or what to do or what to buy, what to consume, in a logical way. But what we'll do is we will actually post-rationalize, and we will make a lot more decisions in emotionally and intuitively, and is with the brands, and that happens as, you know, a heuristic, a shortcut. It's not always processed. But then what we'll do is afterwards we'll put in the logic that you then talk about, or we crave. To say, yeah, well, I bought the decisions based on price or finance per se. Now, I don't want to kind of pretend that it's some mystical voodoo thing out there that's going on, you know, and what we always have to stress is that we do this ethically. You know, it's not kind of, we're not trying to hoodwink anyone with using techniques or anything like that. But, you know, what we'd love to do is make more marketing managers, brand managers aware of the thinking, the consumer behavior, and the thinking process.
You know, early in my marketing career, one of the big heavy components that marketers talked about was brand. It was all about brand. It was your brand. And like many people in the organization that wasn't inside of marketing, to me, brand was absolutely arts and crafts. It was, you know, what are the colors? Is it designed pretty? Is it aesthetically pleasing? And, you know, recently we went through a rebrand or a brand consolidation with an umbrella brand strategy for an organization that was bringing 8 different companies together and trying to take one message to market. And what I found is there's a much more depth and intricacy into what goes into making people believe or giving them the tools that they need to go back and do those convincing I made the right decision, or you know, believing that their decision was right, or justifying their purchase, or whatever it is that makes them feel good about the choices they made in the relationship with your brand. Can you talk a little bit about what some of the additional elements are? And I think the word you use is you call brand essence, but what is it what are the pieces and parts that go into making up your brand essence?
Yeah, so we've actually got a framework we call the 7 E's of brand. So we've built it around a snowflake, and you know, that's a kind of a nod to my my past in the winter sports industry. But it was just an icon that worked really well. And we know a couple of things about snowflakes. Again, sort of schoolboy science. Each one is unique. Right, so you ask about the essence. What we're trying to find is not just a unique selling point, or as the brand guru Marty Neumeier calls it, your onlyness. Okay, so what we're trying to say is that you can be as unique as a snowflake. So we've got a 6-branched. Take my medicine. What we've got to say is we've actually got to do this 2-sided, haven't we? Because we've got to understand what your consumer or potential consumer thinks your essence is. But if we start off in-house, then we at least get an idea of what you would like it to be, or what you would like the perception to be, how you would like to be perceived. And what we boil that right down. So it's the raison d'etre. It's in the same sort of space as the mission, the vision, as your purpose. You know, we love Simon Sinek and, you know, the why. So we ask why. So that essence is the deepest driver, almost even what drives the purpose. So it's really quite deep. And you know, it's the soul of the brand, and we start to put people off. You've got to be careful with some of that language, that, you know, we don't frighten people, that again they think we're a wee bit too mystical or whatever it is. So it's the kind of, it's the beating heart, the essence, and we've got to get right in there. Now there's 2 things, just jumping forward. You know, we workshop this, And we've got some techniques, some fun techniques. If you listen to one of our podcasts, that we're rock fans. We love rock music, and we try and bring that into our work, into the brand strategy. So we'll ask founders or management teams what rock band would represent your brand, and through that we're trying to discover the essence. Or we say, okay, it's pop music or performer if it doesn't quite work with them. So that's our starting point, and then we work our way around experience, emotion, then we go and say, right, go and execute now, and then actually come back, and then the rest is future, looking at the planning, how you're going to be enduring, how you're going to evolve, and then the final one, equity. So then we actually try and quantify this. Now that's a challenge. It's been the holy grail of marketing and advertising, hasn't it, to tell me what's the return on investment, what's the actual financial value in this. So we're working on an equation to try and make it, and quantify that a little bit, and that's called our brand love equation. So yeah, it's a bit of fun as well. It's serious, but hey, we try and have a bit of fun doing it as well.
Sounds like it. So now you said something that I think is really interesting, and you talked about this where you'll take a rock band, or you'll take business and you'll try and compare it to a rock band, and you've done this on your podcast. What I'm interested in is really two things. When you ask people, what rock band do they see themselves as, what are the most common answers? Or is it, hey, they really need to lean more towards pop? Like what type of responses do you get?
Sure. So, the hook of one of our shows, we call it Life in the Brand Lane, which is obviously a play on an Eagles track. And what we do, we challenge brand owners, managers, founders to come to the show, and with 3 tracks, and it's a rock show. So we challenge them to say, look, bring 3 rock tracks. Now, do we have to set parameters from that? Classic rock, we could go pretty soft into country rock or pop rock or whatever. And we don't want to frighten anyone's grandmother by anything too hard either. But you're right. Not everybody can do it, because this is the kind of it's the agility of mind a little bit to go, wait a minute, how can I connect a song that I have not created, that's not within our control, and connect that to the brand? Now, the biggest trap is that people think that they're it's the soundtrack to their promotional campaign. Now, it might be, but what we're actually trying to do is get into that essence. So what are those real deep emotions so for multiple brands. So we went from Guns N' Roses through to the Pretenders, and I wouldn't say that's quite the bookends of the genre, if you like, but it was trying to evoke something of the brand spirit. But yeah, sometimes people will push back, so we soften it and go, okay, let's change the genre. We're actually working with someone just now, and we're going to look at classical music. It's someone who actually works in classical music, so it works. Sometimes that exercise works better with a film icon, or maybe something even more visual, like the perfect house that your brand would live in. We've got to mix it up. And sometimes people are sat there with crossed arms a little bit, going, these guys are crazy. This is like back at art school and high school. I hate this. You've got to try and work with them a little bit, and that's when your facilitation skills have to come in as well.
It's interesting, because when you think about large companies, and we go back to your original statement of you can't rebrand.
Yeah.
But you look at large companies, take an Apple, for example. In many ways, people would say, no, Finley. You've got companies like Apple, they rebranded. You've got companies like Google, they rebranded or they split off and now they call themselves Alphabet. What do you mean you can't rebrand? What about these successful companies that at large scale? Talk a little bit about some of the techniques that allowed companies that are larger or larger that are well known, that why it was they were capable to make the transition from one particular style and market into an entirely different brand presence and go-to-market strategy.
So I would argue, because what we've almost got is two definitions, the one word meaning two different things. So I would argue that Apple and Google didn't rebrand. What they did was they refreshed their mark or changed their logo. So they went from the rainbow multicultural icon to kind of monocolor, silver, whatever. However, if you use our definition or stick to this relationship between the customer and the brand, then Apple were designing information tools or creative tools or entertainment tools. It was to make life simpler. And so those fundamentals, that kind of essence, for changing how people work or letting them be more creative through hardware or enabling them to enjoy entertainment easier in the house. Those fundamentals, I don't believe have changed since the 1980s. Likewise, Google, it was always about making information available. Those fundamentals, they were trying to make information available to everybody. There's a democratic element to it, to make it free and easy and so on. And they've changed the company structure or the mothership, if you like, a little bit. But I think we can get sucked back into, and that's the kind of smoke and mirrors thing, when the mark or the logo changes, it's a rebrand. And that's our argument. Now, I know we have to spend a bit of time educating customers and potential customers, and sometimes you just have to let them go, because it's like, well, good luck. I hope you've got a good agency and that everyone is going to be happy with the outcome. But so that's why I try and get that provocative statement out there as much as I can, on getting a chance to talk on shows like this or elsewhere.
Well, one of the things that I guess when I think about Apple and I think about your particular statement is, I feel like there was a distinctive pivot for Apple, specifically after Jobs came back when they released the Macintosh, and the shift was less about this brand of computer and space age, and they were heavily into education. They're trying to break the mold with their commercial in 1984. Let's show you why 1984 is not really like 1984. But if you look at how they released the Macintosh, what I felt like is they did what you're talking about. They didn't rebrand. They actually leaned harder into their essence. And what came out of it was this embraced culture of thinking differently, behaving differently, changing the molds of the world. And then they went on to pick a fight with Microsoft with their, Mac versus PC ads. And so what it really felt like was not as much a rebrand as just a complete embodiment of their brand essence. Are there other examples that you can think of that are similar where, hey, the company was maybe being too broad, or they were trying to be, too many things to too many people, and it felt like a rebrand, but really what it was is they were just embracing their essence?
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And Steve Jobs was probably the best example of a brand designer in its kind of widest strategic sense, or how to build a brand. He wasn't really a CEO. You know, that he was much more about brand building. So I'll just kind of echo your points first, to say how well they did that. Now, brand is often about, it's quite tribal, because coming back to those fundamental human drivers, you know, mostly we are social creatures. We like to belong to groups, you know, family groups, and then clubs and societies, and that is one of the big drivers behind brand. Now, Apple almost they almost oversimplified that with the Microsoft kind of battle, but you know, they won it and it worked, and it was around the type of people we are. And I think they overplayed it, but they were kind of like, well, if you're creative and you're a bit cool, you're cooler than those guys, then you're in our brand, in our tribe, in our club. And you know, so that's worked for them. I think where it hasn't worked for me right now, and so I think this is like an international brand, is some of the motor marks, the automotive marks. And the one that instantly jumps to mind for me is Porsche, that have moved out of the sports car domain, and are trying to do a little bit of everything. So, you know, they've got not quite cars to fit every type, you know, not quite into the minivan sector yet, but for me, that's been diluted. And it's an old British brand now in the same sector. Jaguar, you know, I feel, you know, they've kind of moved into Jeep SUV type. I think they're great cars and they're probably selling them, but I would say that there's probably only so long that you can milk that until you've undervalued brands, but kind of time will tell on that one, you know.
It's interesting to hear you bring up Jag and Porsche, because for me, I agree. The first time I heard somebody say, yes, I bought a Jag crossover, and I was like, Jaguar has a crossover? Are you kidding me? And when they, you know, they brought their car, and I was like, okay, well, what did this cost? And then they told me the price, and I was like, well, for that amount, you could have gotten a Jag. So why aren't you just driving the traditional car? And I think there's something there that gets lost in translation for the next generation. Not that it's wrong, but you're right. It is very risky because you run a risk of diluting the brand. And I'll pull a little bit on some of the experience that I had. I was talking to you about, you know, the umbrella brand of bringing 8 companies to one and trying to create a cohesive message. Well, we had anywhere from 35 to 12 years of brand equity in the market, where the folks loved and were passionate about the particular products that they were purchasing. And when you tried to bring them all together, and while they were loosely associated and coupled, everybody still had that vehement response to, well, I'm from the other company, or now this is my sister company. Well, why are you partnering with the enemy? Because it was it was taboo for many, 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 many years. And so weaving a cohesive story together was very tricky. And trying to do on top of that of bringing another message to market, it was as much market confusion as it was market clarity. And the part that I thought was most interesting is we weren't, when I say we, the leadership team that I was a part of wasn't as concerned about the unifying message as they were about the color and the archetype and the way that the logo or the mark struck them. You know, we spent countless hours looking at different logos and designs and going through the color wheel, and what if this was blue or yellow? Instead of taking a step back and saying, okay, well, how do we actually tell this story in a way that makes it common sense? And it's easy for somebody to build those reasons to believe, that justification of why this makes sense, or building that relationship across those other 8 brands that historically we've been enemies with. It was a challenging where we spent the time. The time was inornately spent on arts and crafts, and not that there was anything wrong with the work that was done. There was a lot of hard work done there, but it was like that was almost easier than the hard work that it took to really creating a message and narrative that made sense. Do you see that often in what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly the rebrand project that I'm trying to just send out a message of caution, because as you've seen, it's costly, in terms of time and money. It's arts and crafts, that's a nice way of putting it. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, as long as everyone's aware that there are much bigger cultural issues at play here. That sounds like a real brand architecture challenge that you were involved in, bringing in these different brands. They've got their own identity, and that's not the visual. That is the identity of the people, that work there, and the culture. And, probably rightly so, you did see them as different when they were competitors, because they acted differently. They had a different culture. And that's much, much harder to integrate that. Teams of people who have maybe got 20, 30 years of that culture built in than the arts and crafts. And you can do it, but you've got to be grown up sometimes and say, maybe they should keep some sort of autonomy or identity, and maybe that works for everyone. There's an ownership, the business ownership, but maybe the architecture is better that they do have their own identity, and so at that point, their own mark and their own culture. If you shoehorn everyone in together, and then maybe, the risk is that it all becomes a little bit bland, a little bit vanilla, to please everyone or not to upset everyone or some people. I've seen that happen as well.
It's interesting, because I think one of the challenges that I see, and I'm using a stateside based business, I apologize, but Philip and Morris, which is a gigantic tobacco company here, I want to say it was in the 90s, they acquired the Kraft Brands foods.
Okay.
So Kraft mac and cheese. I mean, there's all kinds of different Kraft foods that are out there. And in addition to that, it was also about the time of for America, where it's not delivery, it's DiGiorno. It was a frozen pizza that was kind of the new expanding crust. Like they're from a consumer goods standpoint, you had these unique brands that were in the market. And when Philip and Morris bought Kraft, and when Kraft bought DiGiorno, nobody messed with the brand or the brand message or that specific market. They let it do its own thing because it was driving revenue. It wasn't like all of a sudden cigarettes and pizza brought to you by Philip and Morris. It was DiGiorno is still bringing you your delivery. And one of the things that at least the experience that we navigated through, is when you looked at the business model, not just what we were saying about how we did business, or what we're saying that we did to the market, or what we meant to the market, but when you really boiled it down to how we did business, how the 8 different companies did business, how you did invoicing, how you did licensing, how you did customer service, where you routed and directed phone calls across the entire gamut, you had 8 different motions, and you had 8 different things that people had gotten accustomed to. And all of a sudden we were saying to the market, it's now delivery pizza by Philip and Morris, which all I'd ever thought about Philip and Morris was cigarettes. Great. So
no, I think that's a really good example. And I've sat in enough advertising classes and so on in different schools, analyzed Marlboro Man. And that's such a strong brand. It's constructed so heavily and it's so powerful. We use that as an example. Okay, now there's questions about how ethical it is to sell those products and so on, but in terms of advertising, and you're absolutely right, to then put that iconic cowboy, and alongside any of those other products that you talk about, of course doesn't work. And so it's a really good example. I think people maybe get a little bit too excited when they're involved in merger and acquisition, and they think that everything has to be, it's a takeover, and they all maybe get a little bit too focused or blinkered on everything being unique and under the brand, and they've made a conquest. But the bigger manager or directors possibly allow that brand to have its own space, be a great pizza company in its own right. Thank you very much. And there's better examples of that as well, like Procter and Gamble. That's what they do. They don't shout about Procter and Gamble, but it is the individual brands that they let take prominence, and they manage a kind of a house of brands. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then you look at take for example some of the products by Procter and Gamble, Dove soap.
Yeah.
And the evolution of the brand of Dove over the last 20 years. In what's visually communicated has been a steady Eddie logo, a steady Eddie delivery, and as far as what they're talking about. But what's been modified is how they're taking that brand to market and talking to their audience. And so the rebranding effort, if you want to call it one for Dove, has less to do about product feature function or even the visuals. It's about making sure that it's succinctly communicated to that particular audience and delivering it to them in a way that they understand, which I think is a higher level of intentionality and maturity. It would be very easy to take Dove or Tide. I remember when Tide changed their bags. Think about when Cheetos changed their bags, right? Like you start thinking about when you mess with the visuals. If you're not talking to your audience in a way that they understand or where they're at, you run a giant risk of alienating them.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dove, let's stick with that. I like it, what they've done, and I'm kind of guessing that they've done this across various markets. I've seen some of the activity in other European markets, but in the UK, they've taken what is quite a masculine, macho sport in rugby, okay, and they've used some of the icons there, and what they're kind of playing on is this slight lifestyle change that men are, well, one, spending more money on that type of goods, but they're actually happy to openly do it. So we've seen a kind of a modernization from a very macho culture from some of the P&G brands through the 70s up until today, and I it's a softening of the masculinity almost. And you're right, they're great. They've got some of the best marketers on board there to do that, but also they actually drive that, don't they? Because they're so influential with their big advertising budgets and so on. They can kind of say, look, guys, it's okay to care about your appearance and your skin and so on. So I think that's really interesting take on it.
Well, and there's a couple things that P&G leaned into really hard across their brands. And you think about really identifying with your audience, brands like Dove, Degree, I want to say Gillette, when the Me Too movement happened here in the States. And I don't know if it swept the globe, but it was that there was like, hey, it's what's happening to women in business or in society, specifically stateside. It's just not acceptable. And the way in which that was spun into the advertisement, the way that it was, fight like a girl, and the ads that were created to support this, it's like, it's not, I don't throw like a boy, like you don't throw like a girl, like I throw like me, and created this level of humanity and equity. But then also this creating this safety in their more masculine brands of, it's okay to be a guy who's not super macho or over the top or overbearing. You can still be rugged, but have this tender underside and support this whole movement in equity. And to me, when you start looking at the outward communication of brand, when it trickles down into advertising and an influence, you're right when saying, if I've got a large advertising budget, I have the ability to produce a lot of right, wrong, or otherwise propaganda to influence a positive or a negative change. But if you don't know who you are at your essence, like if you're trying to, if you're the Marlboro man riding up on a horse trying to deliver a pizza, it is not going to work. It doesn't matter what's going on in society. Like that doesn't work. You have to stay true to the rules and the constructs of why somebody fell in love with you, why they have that relationship, and what emotionally they're going through at this particular moment in their journey.
Yeah, I think those are great examples, and they're great icons, and they're an icon of their time. The Marlboro Man, very male and masculine, and wasn't probably going to budge too much. But then Gillette, which was pretty close, but then they actually, let's take our hat off to them that they have, and you're right, that is part of the brand. Now, it can be cynical at times when it's purely done for corporate social responsibility reasons. That's not essence, that's manufactured purpose. And you know what, consumers can smell that. If it's not genuine, if it's not authentic, if you're just bolting that on, then you're going to be found out. But I think there is an awareness that, yeah, you have to be genuinely responsible because you are influential at that point. So I think some of this reflection, that we're all having as individuals, I think brands are doing it, maybe through competitive times. Let's be honest. Gillette, with the direct consumer brands, they were having a massive influence on their sales. They were seeing market share just being eroded by Dollar Shave and so on. So maybe that makes you sit up a little bit and pay attention as well. Wait a minute, have we got a disconnect with consumers? It's not just the ease of purchase. Maybe it's a brand thing, and then they're good enough to be able to react to that, I think.
Well, and I think you're spot on. I think that, and there's a nuance between B2B and B2C. Mm-hmm. In my opinion, not a ton though, because at the end of the day, it's still human to human, right? At some point, there's a human on one side communicating a message and a feeling and a service or a product on the other side, right, to be purchased. And so that exchange, even though it may be entity to entity versus entity to human, it still is a human to human exchange. And I read several years ago, Scientific Advertising by Claude Hopkins. Have you read that book?
I follow someone else who quotes him extensively, a copywriter who but I haven't in its entirety, to be honest with you.
It's an afternoon read. It's not a big, long book, but it does talk about the evolution of advertising. And to me, what I think is interesting is if you look at that, at its core, what Hopkins and a lot of the early copywriters, early admin were doing was spending a lot of time understanding the customer, understanding the business pain or whatever the challenge was, and creating a clear, succinct message to build the brand around, so that you knew, unequivocally, this is what's being solved. This is how this is being solved. Mm-hmm. And what I think is really, really remarkable, we look at large entities. I'm in Houston, so we've got the Shells, the Chevrons, the British Petroleums. We've got the big boys in the energy, and you think, oh, what is brand to these guys? But if you go back 100 years, 115 years, you can see where organizations like Shell Oil or Sinclair Corporation, where they were placing ads to convince people to buy their product before they became this giant corporate conglomerate of energy. They were just a company that had something that was trying to provide light into your home. And so there's There's this natural evolution that will happen. But if I look at those large organizations today, that's not what I see. I don't see a company that's just providing a simple service to my home. I see this giant behemoth that, has all these different things, and brand has become incredibly complex. Wouldn't it be interesting if you could take them and distill it back down to a very simple, easy to understand, human to human message?
Yeah, I think that's that. Yes, it would be, to simply answer your question. And I was just thinking while you were saying that, how brand has become connected to these much, the behemoths or the much larger organizations. But you're right, they were probably showing the fundamental principles when they first set out. And we try to flip that round a little bit to say, let's learn from the big brands, but we use more of the consumer and the better examples like Apple or Coca-Cola or whoever it is, and say, look, brand is not the domain of those huge businesses. You can and be a medium-sized player, but use the techniques that they use. But I think you're right. Sometimes it just becomes so huge that it's almost impossible to communicate what your fundamentals are. You're just almost too broad and too huge to do that.
Well, and I think it was interesting because when you and I were talking on our prep call ahead of this, you actually had some very relatable examples of brands that you thought were doing a really, really good job delivering their message and providing, a quality product or service in the market. Give us some of those examples and share, what are some of the guys that are doing it right?
So I think I've got two, and one is a Scottish brand who's doing really well, rolling out globally now. I know they've got a footprint in Columbus, Ohio. So it's Brewdog, which is a brewery, fundamentally a brewery. They do a bit of distilling. But what they also do is they control the bars. So they own a large chain now of bars that are eateries. And, slight disclosure here, it's not a big deal. I bought a couple of shares early doors with them. So, there's a bit of a kind of personal interest here. And a lot of people ask me why you did that. And I bought into the brand. I love their beers. I had a liquor license at the time, and I started selling their beers as well. So it was good quality beer, it still is. But I bought into their kind of off the wall culture, right? They love the big gestures. They're mavericks. They're the underdogs now. As it happens, they're really becoming one of the bigger dogs. But there they were very much the rebel. They've matured. The brand has now matured, and what I think they're doing is great in terms of brand because they've actually risen above the commercial competition, and they are making the planet their serious mission. So the brand is on a mission to save the planet, not wanting to be too grandiose about it, but they've kind of gone, right, okay, we do good beer, we do good bars, but the big issue here is to save the planet. So they've actually been able to make themselves negative carbon emitters, which is quite amazing, So I just think that's great to almost just take the conversation somewhere entirely different. And that's really what they're talking about just now. And the other is it's an Australian brand, but there's Scottish origin. So forgive me. It's rock and roll, AC/DC. There's a new album coming out. It's the 40th anniversary of one of their seminal works, Back in Black. And they've reformed. They've got the old band together and replaced poor old Malcolm that died. His cousins come in to play on the album. And the reason I think they're so good is because they've got this amazing energy about a new album. And, here's a band that's over 40 years old and they're still doing the same thing. It's pretty much the same album that I bought 40 years ago when I bought Back in Black. So they are consistent. they're consistent, but they've, there's a promotional campaign just now, little teases about, when it's coming out and what it's going to sound like. We know what it's going to sound like. And so they've kind of almost done the reverse of Brewdog, that have kind of gone, right, okay, we're way above this. AC/DC don't even get involved in that type of conversation, about trying to differentiate themselves or reposition themselves or anything fancy. It's like, yeah, but in brand terms, it's about consistency, and they're totally authentic. So there's two for you. I hope they make a bit of sense.
That's fantastic. So does that mean that AC/DC is your favorite band of all time?
It's always hard to say, it's kind of horses for courses, isn't it? I'm also listening to Led Zeppelin 3 just now. That's 50 years old this week. So I'd be hard pushed to call it between those two bands, depending on what sort of mood I'm in, what I'm listening to, so yeah, but they're just kind of, because they're iconic just now and getting quite a lot of focus. They're two that I'm talking about and listening to quite a lot. Moved back onto vinyl as well, just as an aside, just for the full effect.
Yeah, well, it's bringing that classic rock back in its classic delivery, right?
Yeah.
Well, Finley, I really appreciate you being a guest on today's show, sharing your insights on what you can and can't do as it relates to brand and branding. You mentioned it a little bit a couple times, but just give us the short commercial on your podcast as it relates to classic rock and how people can get involved with that.
Yeah, that would be absolutely great. If anybody would like to come over and listen, you'll find us on all the usual channels. We are Fresh Business Thinking with the Brand Guys, and hopefully we should pop up in your feed. And one of the shows that we do is around classic rock. So if that floats your boat, then by all means tune in.
That's awesome. Well, we'll definitely have a link in the podcast description here for getting in contact with the Brand Guys in one of your episodes, or the episode as it relates to classic rock. If somebody has questions about brand essence or branding in general, and they want to reach out, Finley, how can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, so again, that's really kind to let me have that plug. So we are Fresh, but it's spelled FREJZ, FREJZ.biz, fresh.biz. And you can find all the information there and get in touch with us. We'd really appreciate that.
That's great. Well, thank you again for being a guest on the show. It's been awesome discussing brand with you.
Not at all, Kyle. Likewise, I think it's a great conversation. I think we could probably sit here for longer, just throwing some of these ideas about. So, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's been our pleasure. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in again. Tune in next week when we cover a new topic, something fun, something interesting, and something I'm curious about on the summit.